Alexander Skutch was one of the most important ornithologists of the 20th century. Many birders in the U.S. don't know much about him because he lived most of his life in Central America. He was a naturalist and philosopher who, like Henry David Thoreau, built a house in a secluded woodland. But instead of remaining for 30 months, as Thoreau did near Walden Pond, Dr. Skutch lived in his Costa Rica house for more than 60 years. He died in May 2004, about a week shy of his 100th birthday. He was born in Baltimore, and his family moved to a farm outside the city when he was 3. On the farm, he developed a love for nature. He entered Johns Hopkins University at 17 and earned a doctorate in botany at age 24. He worked in Honduras and Guatemala before going to Costa Rica in 1935 and living there almost continuously until his death. During the late 1930s, Dr. Skutch worked at the National Museum in Costa Rica, but he didn't enjoy being indoors looking at lifeless specimens. He was deeply disappointed when he looked at existing bird research. He found a great many specimens that had been shot, measured, and cataloged, but little information about behavior or nesting habits. An encounter with a Rufous-tailed hummingbird opened his eyes to the possibilities of bird study and inspired him to fulfill his yearning to learn about the secret lives of free animals. He left the job, and in 1941 he built a wilderness home about 50 miles south of the capital in San Jose. Dr. Skutch did more than any neotropical ornithologist to remedy the lack of information about the behavior and habits of birds. Over the decades, he observed birds in the field and produced 3 volumes of life histories of Central American birds, published in 1954, 1960, and 1969. Cumulatively, they include more than 150 species, with more than 1,600 pages of text. The magnitude of this achievement seems more astounding when one reads the case studies and realizes the countless hours he spent in the field, waiting and watching at nests. He produced additional volumes of studies of tropical American birds, as well as co-authoring a field guide of Costa Rican birds. He produced numerous books about families of birds worldwide, including tanagers, woodpeckers, hummingbirds, pigeons, flycatchers, blackbirds, antbirds, and ovenbirds. On a trip to Costa Rica, I visited the house where Dr. Skutch lived. He named it Los Casingos, the Spanish name of the fiery-billed aracari, a bird in the toucan family. He later regretted the name because aracaris raid songbird eggs and nestlings. During my visit, fiery-billed aracaris were in the trees around the parking area near his house. On one path near the house was an army ant swarm. Bicolored antbirds were perched near the ant swarm, hoping to pick off insects or other wildlife flushed by the ants. Speckled tanagers were at one of the feeding tables near the parking area. These colorful birds are in a different family than the tanagers in the U.S. The hummingbird feeders were visited by Rufous-tailed hummingbirds, the species who inspired Dr. Skutch to study free birds in the wild. On the forest trails near the house, ruddy woodcreepers foraged on tree trunks. Helicopter damselflies were flying near one of the paths. A male green honeycreeper was in the trees. Dr. Skutch's house has a U-shaped design and looks the way it was when he lived there. The left side of the U has the kitchen with pots, utensils, bowls, and an oven. Next to the kitchen is the dining room, which has a cabinet with china and serving items. The rooms on the bottom of the U overlook the gardens behind the house. The first one was where Dr. Skutch and his wife slept. A closet had hangers with some of Dr. Skutch's clothing, along with boots, walking sticks, and a machete. Next door was a room where Mrs. Skutch spent a lot of time. It had lots of books, a sewing machine, and a small television. The next room was Dr. Skutch's study. He typed all of his 40 books and other works on manual typewriters. I once ate dinner with Dana Gardner, who did the artwork for many of Dr. Skutch's books. Dana lived in Los Angeles, and he told me that he would search in antique stores for manual typewriters so that he could send the ribbons to Dr. Skutch. A manual typewriter and a pencil sharpener were on Dr. Skutch's work table. The study also had a number of old cameras and old binoculars. The other side of the U has 2 rooms. One was where his adopted son slept. The other was the bathroom, which still had 2 toothbrushes neatly laid out. The house has no glass or screens in the window openings, with one exception. Having glassless windows prevented many bird deaths from collisions, as well as removing barriers between Dr. Skutch and nature. The house also has no ceilings. You can see up into the rafters. Dr. Skutch was well read in literature, philosophy, world religions, and history. He became a vegetarian after reading Percy Bysshe Shelley's poetry and essays. He did not like to feel that any of the humans or animals who assisted in the work on his property were acting under compulsion. He believed in the Indian concept of ahimsa, which is the bedrock of Jainism. It means without harm, and it entails a compassionate concern for all life forms, from the largest animals to the tiniest organisms. He extended this tenderness for living things to plants, and he thought there is a strong relationship between a society's agricultural practices and its spiritual level. Dr. Skutch believed that nobody with an adequate appreciation of the Earth's uniqueness, beauty, and bounty would wage war, which he regarded as an example of our technical skills outrunning our moral competence. He thought that the great tragedy of biology is the difficulty of acquiring certain kinds of information without harming living things. He was proud that during his 70 years of neotropical bird study, he never intentionally harmed, for science or otherwise, any adult or young birds he studied. He admitted to killing a few raptors who preyed upon birds he was studying, and he killed numerous snakes for the same reason. To Dr. Skutch, refusing to come to the aid of a bird whose nest is menaced by a snake would be like failing to help a family member or friend being brutalized by a stranger. Some of his best work involves behavioral studies. Parent Birds and Their Young, published in 1976, is a 500-page study of all aspects of the mating and breeding behaviors of the birds of the world. A related book is Helpers at Birds' Nests, which deals with birds giving assistance at the nest to others who are not their mate or their young. Dr. Skutch was the first to report this behavior when early in his career he observed brown jays doing it. Birds Asleep, published in 1987, is a survey of an activity that even the most avid birders rarely observe, but Dr. Skutch compiled enough material to write a book about it. The Minds of Birds, published in 1996, was his book that created the most controversy. It presents evidence that the mental capacities of birds are greatly underestimated. He had trouble finding a publisher for the book because at the time the scientific community had a deep prejudice against suggestions that creatures other than humans are capable of certain types of mental processes. The views he expressed in this book were vindicated shortly after his death when scientists discovered that the brains of birds are far more complex, flexible, and inventive than was previously thought by most ornithologists, especially ornithologists who spend most of their time looking at museum skins rather than observing the behavior of wild birds. Dr. Skutch learned about nature by immersing himself in it and becoming part of it. His autobiographical works intersperse events from his life with field observations because he didn't perceive a strict demarcation between the two. In Nature Through Tropical Windows, published in 1983, he describes sightings from the glassless windows of his home. He thought we should consider the possibility that the Earth can support only a certain total of human beings throughout its entire existence, so that the greater the number of people who crowd it today and drain its resources, the fewer it will be able to support in future ages. He believed that conservation is where ecology and ethics meet. 2 years after his death, his book Moral Foundations was published. It examines morality and ethics and their antecedents in the animal kingdom and the universe at large. Dr. Skutch said that much of his life was a revolt against the harsher aspects of nature, especially predation. He believed that the process of evolution deserves our approval only to the extent to which it makes existence more satisfying and desirable, and it doesn't deserve our approval when it is harsh and wasteful. He considered photosynthesis to be the highest achievement of evolution and the basic good in the living world, upon which all of the Earth's constructive processes, beauty, and joy depend. He thought predation and overpopulation are basic evils, causing most of the ills in nature. He took the naturalist Aldo Leopold to task for suggesting that the grizzly bear is nature's outstanding achievement in the wilderness. Dr. Skutch thought that many small, weak animals, especially songbirds, are far more outstanding and admirable evolutionary achievements by any criterion we choose except weight and strength. He said that perfection is most often found in little things, noting that our planet, which he saw as the fairest in the solar system, is tiny as celestial bodies go. I met Dr. Skutch when I was in Costa Rica in 1997 for a birding conference. I saw Mrs. Skutch in my hotel lobby having trouble finding out where Dr. Skutch was supposed to go for a book signing. I knew where it was and offered to take him there. Dr. Skutch was 93 and frail, so Mrs. Skutch asked me to take one of his hands while she took the other. As we walked slowly, I told him how much his work meant to me and how it had encouraged me to become much more interested in observing bird behavior than in merely trying to see a lot of birds to put on a checklist. Dr. Skutch said, "I'd rather know a few birds well." In fact, Dr. Skutch knew an enormous number of bird species as well as anyone has ever known them, and his work is still very much worth reading. You can read many of his books and articles on the website alexanderskutch.com.